Disguised weapons. Ever since the invention of firearms, weapons designers have constantly sought to improve them. Some focused on increasing the range or accuracy, while others wanted to increase the rate of fire or the ammunition capacity. This has led to the creation of iconic and infamous weapons that can lay down a blistering rate of fire to mow down scores of enemies or deliver pinpoint accurate shots from unbelievable distances. There are some firearm designs that went a different route though. Made with concealment in mind, here are a few examples of seemingly mundane objects that hold a deadly secret. The briefcase gun. In the 1970s, a spree of terrorist attacks led to the need for protection among politicians and other prominent members of society. Seeing an opportunity, the German firearm manufacturer Heckler & Koch began development on a way for the bodyguards of these individuals to carry extra firepower in a concealed package. Known as the Spezialkoffer or special case, the briefcase gun is a nondescript case that would not seem out of place in any office or government building. Inside, however, instead of containing paperwork, it held an HK-MP5 submachine gun. Already a compact weapon, the MP5 was and still is a mainstay of SWAT teams and other forces around the world who engage in close-quarter fighting. With the addition of the Spezialkoffer, the versatility of the weapon only increased. The briefcase gun consisted of an aluminum case coated in a black plastic finish and weighed in at 3.3 pounds without the firearm. At one side is an opening for the muzzle of an MP5K, the shortest variant of the MP5. The gun would be mounted to the case on a claw hook and connected to the trigger with a series of metal actuators. To fire the weapon, the case's trigger was located on the carrying handle. There was no extractor for empty shell casings. The expended round simply fell to the bottom of the case. H&K also created a Spezialtasche, or special bag, which was disguised as a leather carrying case, which had an opening, allowing the user to insert his hand to more effectively operate the weapon inside, and does not have an integrated trigger on the handle. To use, the operator needed to reach inside the case to operate the gun manually. The briefcase gun is easily concealed for use by the bodyguards of VIPs. Should the need arise, they can deliver a stream of firepower without having to draw a weapon, enabling them to respond quickly to any threat. There are some drawbacks, however. Aiming the case is difficult, since bringing it to a standard firing position is awkward at best and defeats the purpose of already available firepower, and would only be effective at very close range. There are also no controls over the firearm other than the trigger. To access the weapon, such as to reload, the case would have to be opened and the weapon removed before reloading, clearing jams or any other function. This can be done easily by simply opening the case with a pair of stainless steel clasps, though this costs precious seconds when time is the most critical. H&K sold thousands of these cases, with a very large number being sent to the Middle East. During the 2003 invasion of Iraq, American forces found 24 of them, though they had not been used. In the Soviet Union, another briefcase gun was created, which has a similar but much simpler design than the H&K version. The carrying handle is attached directly to the weapon, in this case an AKS-74U. When activated, the rest of the case simply drops away, leaving the handle and the weapon still in the grasp of the user, and it's ready to fire in the standard way. The handle can be detached easily, so the sights will not be obstructed when firing. Known as the operational briefcase, the system was intended for use by KGB officers who would need additional firepower while not openly carrying an assault rifle.
Here, check this out, an S-tier MP5 SMG. It's perfect for close-quarter combat, and it's a favorite of private security mercs worldwide. But would this thing be any good today, since no one uses briefcases anymore unless, I don't know, you're an old-school Wall Street guy?
Fountain pen guns. The pen is mightier than the sword, and some took this to heart. As far back as the 19th century, with the introduction of self-contained metallic cartridges, all manner of firearms were constructed around everyday objects, such as umbrellas, canes, watches, and a host of other items. One of the most popular items that contained a hidden firearm were simple fountain pens. In the 20th century, pens were commonly used as a way for someone, usually a spy or some other type of undercover agent, to carry a weapon without arousing suspicion. There are many different models of pen guns with their own unique characteristics, but they do share some common traits. They're usually small in caliber, since the pen gun has to be able to pass itself off as a regular pen, so large cartridges such as rifle rounds and shotgun shells are unfeasible. One antique pen gun in possession of the FBI was chambered for .38 short Colt, an obsolete black powder cartridge, while others are chambered in .22, a .32 ACP, and a number of others. Also, due to the size restraints, these guns are single shot only. As they often lack an extractor or ejector, the pen must be broken open or even disassembled, the spent casing manually removed, a new cartridge placed, and the weapon reassembled before being able to fire again. Since pen guns are designed for concealability rather than effectiveness, they come with serious drawbacks as a weapon. Apart from the fact that they're only single shot, another issue is their range and accuracy, or more specifically, the lack of any. Because it's the length of a regular pen, the gun's barrel is small. Since the expanding gases from the cartridge don't have time to build up before the bullet exits the barrel, the projectile has a low muzzle velocity, regardless of its caliber. Accuracy also suffers as a result of this, with one source stating that hitting anything further away than 20 feet with any precision would be next to impossible. Overall, pen guns are useless in a protracted firefight, or any altercation for that matter where the enemy is likely to shoot back. They're best used clandestinely, able to deliver a one-off shot at near point-blank range to unsuspecting targets that believe the wielder is unarmed. This may work for assassinations or as a self-defense tool, but otherwise pen guns are more at home on the big screen or as a novelty piece for firearm enthusiasts. Cane guns and poacher's guns. For those who want concealed firepower with a little more heft than a pen could provide, an alternative in the form of a cane gun was available. Housed around a gentleman's walking stick, they can be chambered with more powerful rounds, such as rifle rounds and shotgun shells. These are very rudimentary weapons, essentially just a barrel, a trigger, and simple manual ejectors for the spent casing, and rarely have other features such as a sight. These are intended as self-defense weapons, so a gentleman can defend himself against would-be attackers at all times, but are more often novelty pieces for eccentric collectors. They're somewhat difficult to produce compared to dedicated firearms due to the engineering required to make the gun usable, while also being able to pass itself off as an ordinary cane, and their use was often relegated to the upper classes. Similar to and often confused with cane guns are poacher's guns, foldable firearms designed for those who chose to ignore hunting laws. They were common in Great Britain during the early 20th century, though they were often manufactured in other countries, particularly Belgium. Among the most common were single-shot break-open firearms, chambered in .410, and were available in 1 or 2 barrels. The buttstock would have large cutaways, and the mechanisms are rudimentary, all in an effort to save weight and space. Weighing in at a mere 3.5 pounds, about the same as a large pistol, it was easy to hide under a coat, which allowed a poacher to amble around the countryside seemingly unarmed. If the opportunity arose, the weapon could be unfolded and game could be harvested, with complete disregard for landowners' property. Obviously, these guns weren't advertised as poacher's guns. Instead, they were portrayed as a simple firearm for hunting rabbits and other small game, or as a starter weapon for a boy to practice his skills with. They were often unmarked and were sold without a company name, serial number, or any other identifying marking, advertised simply as single folding guns. Poacher's guns were also inexpensive. In the 1912 catalog, they started at 1.5 pounds, about 123 pounds or $150 in today's money, making them affordable to the lower classes of society. Due to legislation regarding firearms, self-defense, and hunting, both cane guns and poacher's guns are rare, found mostly in private collections, as museum pieces, or gathering dust in a forgotten corner of an attic. The glove gun. During the Second World War, the race was on for weapons designers to create more deadly firearms that would give their side an edge against the opposition. While no doubt creative, there were some attempts that perhaps were best left on the drawing board. Patented in 1944, the Jile OSS-38 was designed for the Office of Naval Intelligence by Stanley Haight and was designated as the hand-firing mechanism Mark II. The mechanism is a single-shot, break-open firearm that chambers a single .38 round. The entire apparatus would be mounted on the back of a regular leather work glove. The weapon is fired by a plunger parallel to the 3-inch barrel. To fire the weapon, the user would simply make a fist and punch the intended target, delivering a single devastating blow. It could be activated by using the opposite hand, though this places the user's fingers dangerously close to the business end of the firearm. A second shot required the user to break open the piece, remove the empty cartridge manually, load a new one, and then close the weapon. If all else fails, the wielder also has a solid piece of steel on his fist to bludgeon the victim with. The Jile was intended to be sent to the Pacific Theater for use by troops who were fighting the Japanese. Unlike most other disguised weapons, the glove gun was not designed for assassinations. Obviously, concealment is next to impossible unless the user is wearing exceptionally long sleeves and keeps their hands at their sides at all times. Instead, the gun glove was a last resort weapon. The intention would be to issue it to troops who, in theory, would have a weapon on hand literally at all times. Should the soldier be caught off guard without his regular weapon, he would still have a chance of fighting back, should he be captured. When the potential prisoner is being checked before being taken captive, a single punch to the head would give him a chance to escape. The weapon was mounted on the back of the glove rather than the front, so that the user still had full use of his hands for his normal duties without getting in the way. There are some drawbacks to this weapon. The range was point blank, literally. The target must be within arm's reach for it to work. Should the intended victim simply see the punching coming and step back, the weapon becomes useless. Furthermore, since it was designed as a last-chance weapon for those being captured, it only has one round. Should there be another enemy soldier covering them, there's no chance of reloading for another shot, no matter what the distance. Finally, the weapon has a safety catch in order to prevent accidental discharges. This would have to be deactivated before use. Otherwise, the user will simply be punching an armed captor with no extra effect. Information about the use of the glove gun is virtually non-existent, though there are some indications that some found their way into the hands of Naval Construction Battalions, or CBs. It's unknown how many were made, with estimates ranging from 50 to about 200. There are no recorded cases of it actually being used in combat, and it's gone down in history as a creative piece of military hardware that has limited applications and has more impact in Hollywood than on the battlefield.
Would you want to get hit by this thing? Man, I know I wouldn't want to. And did you know this glove made a cameo in Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Basterds? Yeah, in the movie it was used by one of them during their mission to kill the bad guys.
The UC-9 submachine gun. As a rule, submachine guns are designed to provide compact firepower in a compact frame. Not content with simply making a smaller weapon, gunsmith Utah Connor took a different path to create a concealable firearm. The UC-9, also known as the DEB M21 after David E. Boatman, a collaborator on the project, is functionally an Uzi submachine gun, chambered for 9mm parabellum and with a cyclic rate of fire of between 700 and 900 rounds per minute, fed from a 32-round magazine, and with some minor modifications to the internal workings, it's identical to the more famous counterpart. Already a compact and relatively easily concealed weapon, the UC-9 takes concealability one step further. While most foldable weapons feature a simple folding stock to save space, the UC-9 folds entirely in half. This allows it to collapse into a small, easily carried box that looks nothing like a firearm. When needed, the weapon can be unfolded to its full length. Then the magazine well pistol grip dropped into position and the charging handle pulled to cock the weapon, and it was ready to fire, the whole process taking only a few seconds. The weapon is uncocked and has no round in the chamber while folded, making it safe to transport without the risk of an accidental discharge. In order to help the UC-9 blend in further, the outer shell of the weapon was disguised to look like a portable stereo from the 1980s, known as a boombox, and even included a large carrying handle and a telescopic antenna to complete the illusion. Connor made 9 complete guns, together with about 100 receivers, before the Hughes Act took effect in 1986. making the creation of new fully automatic firearms for civilians in the U.S. illegal. After his death, the extra receivers were transferred to Michael Shine, who updated the design, refining the internal workings into a more efficient pattern from the proof of concept created by Connor. Shine also removed the boombox exterior, since by the time he was able to produce his version of the weapon, this technology was woefully outdated and would only serve to draw more attention. Instead, the folded-up UC9 resembles a nondescript carrying case that can blend in virtually anywhere. Because only a few of the weapons were made before production ended, as well as the myriad of legal restrictions on automatic weapons, the few dozen UC9s on the market today fetch a hefty price at over $12,000 apiece. Though novel in its design, the idea of a foldable concealed firearm of this type never caught on, and the project is seen as a novelty of the firearms world.
So, the UC9 SMG had an appearance in the 1990 movie RoboCop 2. This seemingly harmless-looking gun has its charging handle dangerously close to the muzzle. This design could blow your fingers off, man. The shooter's hand is right next to the muzzle when you charge it. And speaking of dangerous,
KGB poison guns. On September 7, 1978, Bulgarian playwright and defector Georgy Markov was waiting for a bus at Waterloo Bridge in London when he felt a sharp pain in the back of his right thigh. Turning quickly, he saw a man picking up an umbrella who apologized for poking him in the leg with it, before hurrying across the street to a waiting taxi. Shortly after, Markov developed a high fever, had difficulty speaking, and increased blood pressure. He was rushed to the hospital and died 4 days later. A post-mortem analysis discovered a 1.5mm sphere made from iridium and platinum, with a pair of holes drilled into it forming a well. Though it cannot be confirmed, it was deduced that the well probably contained ricin, a deadly poison, and the pellet coated with wax, which kept the toxin in place, which melted at body temperature, releasing the ricin. Further examination of Markov's clothing shed some light on the murder weapon. Since the pellet was fired at point-blank range, a combustible propellant such as gunpowder would leave some trace of burn material, which was not found. It was likely that the weapon used was a pneumatic pellet gun disguised as a common umbrella, the propulsion provided by a CO2 canister. In all likelihood, the culprit was the Bulgarian State Security Service, who acted in corroboration with the Soviet KGB. Markov was an outspoken critic of Bulgaria's communist regime and was a regular contributor to Radio Free Europe, which sought to undermine communist governments. Adding credence to this claim was an attempted assassination of another Bulgarian defector, Vladimir Kostov. Kostov was living in Paris and was also struck in the leg by a small pellet, which exhibited the same symptoms, though he did manage to recover. This wasn't the only time poison guns were used to rid communist governments of undesirables. In the late 1950s, the KGB would authorize the assassination of 2 Ukrainian nationalists living abroad. In 1957, Lev Rebet, former leader of the Ukrainian government, collapsed in his Munich office. The diagnosis of his death was a heart attack. 2 years later, Stefan Bandera, a Ukrainian resistance leader and anti-communist, likewise collapsed in a Munich street. His death, however, was attributed to acute cyanide poisoning. The exact cause of these deaths and their connection would not become clear until 1961, when the assassin, Bogdan Stashinsky, defected to West Berlin. He revealed his reasoning behind the killings as well as the means. Both men were killed by the use of poison mist guns, which operate on the same principle as a perfume atomizer, similar to a common spray bottle. These metal tubes would contain cyanide, which would be sprayed into the face of the target, who would inhale the gas and then collapse, dying of an apparent heart attack. This is exactly what happened to Lev Rebet, who was assassinated with a single-barrel design of the weapon. Bandera would be killed with a refined version of the mist gun, which contained 2 barrels. Stashinsky activated both barrels of cyanide into Bandera's face, but due to the high concentration of poison, the chemical was detected, ruling out natural causes as a means of death. While the weapons do not hide in plain sight as well as a pellet gun umbrella, they're small enough that they could be hidden in a folded-up newspaper or other inconspicuous object. Also, unlike conventional firearms that make a loud bang when fired, These weapons are nearly silent, which enables an assassin to poison his target without drawing undue attention, a vital component of clandestine operations. While technically not firearms, as they don't use a combustible powder to propel their payload, these devices are no less deadly to those unfortunate enough to encounter them.
Yeah, after learning about that KGB poison gun, it's kind of like jumping into a real-life James Bond movie. All these covert weapons hidden in everyday objects, they kind of blur the line between spy movies and the realities of clandestine warfare. In the world of espionage, danger lurks around every corner.
The Xray camera gun. Sometimes hidden weapons are not designed, but rather improvised for nefarious purposes. In 1946, Pearl Lusk, who had recently moved to New York City, was approached by a man named Alan LaRue, an insurance adjuster who asked the recently unemployed woman to follow a suspected jewel thief. Agreeing, LaRue provided Lusk with what he called an X-ray camera, which would be able to detect any stolen jewelry on the suspected thief. The camera was itself wrapped in a green and red package, resembling a Christmas present. On New Year's Eve, Lusk found her target, Olga Trapani Rocco, near the Times Square station. As per LaRue's instruction, she aimed the shutter of the camera low at Rocco's waist. The location the suspected stolen jewels would be found. When she pulled the tripwire to activate the camera, a loud explosion was heard. Rocco fell to the ground screaming. Police were quickly on the scene, and Rocco was rushed to the hospital where her leg was amputated, though she did survive. An investigation revealed that the X-ray camera contained a hidden shotgun. Lusk was taken into custody, and it soon transpired that Alan LaRue was actually Alphonse Rocco, Olga's husband, whose marriage had been annulled 2 months prior to the incident. He'd been threatening his ex-wife since their split, requiring Olga to seek police protection. After the shooting, a manhunt for Rocco ensued. They eventually caught up with him in upstate New York, and after a brief shootout, he was killed by police. For her part in the shooting, Pearl Lusk would be released from custody. And incidentally, she and Olga Trapani would become friends, keeping in touch for many years afterwards. Throughout history, there are numerous examples of those who used ingenious means to baffle prying eyes and hide deadly weapons in plain sight.
So, there's many examples of weapons hidden in plain sight. I mean, they're kind of ingenious, right? But if you were going to rank these guns, which one do you think is the best? I think the X-ray gun is definitely S tier. World War II weapons still in use today. They may be old, outdated, and gathering dust, but World War II weapons are still lethal bits of military tech that should not be taken lightly. Even now, among the arsenals of modern armies and police forces, these tried and tested instruments of death can still be found doing their job like it was 1945 all over again. The STG-44. Today, the standard issue firearms for nations around the world are classified as assault rifles, which are lightweight, have fully automatic capabilities, can be operated by a single soldier, and most importantly, fires an intermediate cartridge, which is a shortened rifle round. There have been many different assault rifles designed over the decades, but all trace their origins to the Sturmgewehr 44. The Sturmgewehr 44, which literally translates to storm rifle, but is usually translated as assault rifle, began development in 1942 by the German military, which was looking for a way to give more firepower to individual soldiers. While the STG-44 wasn't the first attempt at an assault rifle concept, it was the first to go into widespread production. Designed by Hugo Schmeisser, the STG-44 fired a 7.92 by 33mm Kurz cartridge, a shortened version of the 7.92 by 57mm Mauser, which was the standard rifle round for the German military. Though the round was smaller and had a shorter range, studies showed that most engagements happened between 200 and 600 meters, making the long-range capabilities of the standard round unnecessary for the majority of the fighting. The smaller round allowed the soldier to carry more ammunition, a necessity given the 500 to 600 round per minute fire rate of the STG. It would be fed by a 30-round detachable box magazine, which is now a standard feature on most modern assault rifles. Overall, about 425,000 STG-44s were produced between 1943 and 1945 and were first issued to German forces in 1944. In spite of its innovative design and capabilities, the war had already turned against Germany, and the introduction of the STG was too little, too late to stem the tide of Allied advances. After the war, captured STG-44s were studied by many nations around the world, leading to the creation of the legendary AK-47 and its successors, possibly the most successful firearm in history, and more broadly, the adoption of assault rifles as the main firearm issued to modern soldiers. Even though it inspired virtually all modern standard-issue weapons, there are some that still use the STG even today. While no modern armies use the STG-44, many rebel and insurgent groups managed to get a hold of this earliest design of assault rifle. In 2012, Syrian rebels stumbled upon a cache of 5,000 STG-44s, which were still in usable condition, and these were pressed into service in the civil war in that country. In 2014, Ukrainian soldiers were seen equipped with STG-44s during the conflict in the contested Donbass region, though there's little evidence that these classic pieces of military hardware are being used in the current conflict in Ukraine. The M2 HMG. If it isn't broken, don't fix it. When it comes to the M2 Browning heavy machine gun, this axiom has been taken to heart. During the First World War, American General John Pershing saw the need for a new, heavier machine gun that could combat ever-increasingly powerful vehicles, such as aircrafts and tanks. Taking up the challenge, John Browning scaled up his already successful M1917 30-caliber machine gun, chambering the new weapon in 50 caliber, creating what would eventually become the Browning M2 machine gun. The M2, or Ma Deuce as it's affectionately known, is a massive weapon weighing in at 84 pounds. Though the AN variant weighs in at only 60 pounds, still far too heavy for use by infantry. In spite of this, the M2 would be readily adopted by the U.S. military in 1933. During the Second World War, the M2 was used by the U.S. military as a general-purpose machine gun, effective against infantry, light vehicles, and aircraft. In addition to being used at fixed emplacements such as bunkers, it would be mounted on virtually any vehicle that the U.S. fielded, including jeeps, tanks, and trucks. Ships would have a bank of dual and quad M2s for anti-aircraft purposes, and would be used on both fighters and bombers as offensive and defensive weaponry. For mobile anti-aircraft capabilities, 4 M2s would be incorporated into the M45 quad mount, a turret that could be fitted onto a vehicle. The immense firepower that could be unleashed from this weapon system earned it the name, the Meat Chopper. The M2 is also a highly accurate weapon with a range of well over a mile. During the Vietnam War, legendary Marine Corps sniper Carlos Hathcock scored a number of confirmed kills with an M2 and a telescopic sight. He was aided in his efforts by the relatively low rate of fire, around 450 to 500 rounds per minute, which allowed a skillful user to fire one round at a time. The Ma Deuce is also extremely reliable and can serve for years. In 2015, a 94-year-old M2 was brought in for refurbishment and was still in operable condition after almost a century of regular use. Because of its long service life, the M2 is the longest-serving firearm still in use by the U.S. military, with no indication that this is going to change anytime soon. Lee Enfield and variants. Arguably, the most successful firearm used during the Second World War that's still in service is the Lee Enfield family of bolt-action rifles. This British-made weapon, in one form or another, has been in service since the 19th century and is still a popular choice for militaries around the world. The first Lee Enfield was an update of the earlier Lee Metford bolt-action rifle and entered service in 1895. During the First World War, British and Commonwealth troops were primarily equipped with the Mark III SMLE, or Short Magazine Lee Enfield. It was revolutionary for its day, featuring a 10-round detachable magazine of .303 caliber cartridges, double that of most other bolt-action rifles of that era. This large magazine capacity and efficient ergonomics, which allowed the soldier to work the bolt while maintaining a consistent sight picture, led to the development of the Mad Minute, in which a trained soldier could fire up to 30 aimed rounds per minute. Many Germans facing concentrated fire from groups of British riflemen thought they were under attack by machine guns. After the war, the SMLE was redesigned, and during the 1930s, the Mark III's successor, designated Rifle No. 4, was created. It still fired the .303 cartridges from a 10-round magazine, but was simpler and easier to manufacture. The Rifle No. 4 featured a heavier barrel, a reconfigured sight, and was issued with a spiked bayonet, as opposed to the bladed pattern 1907 bayonet used on the Mark III. During the interwar years, the British military changed the naming convention of its rifles, and the Mark III was redesignated to the Rifle No. 1 Mark III. The Rifle No. 4 would go on to be the standard infantry rifle of Britain and the Commonwealth nations throughout the conflict. Other sub-variants such as the Rifle No. 5 and specialist versions for sniping and training would be produced. When the war was over, the Rifle No. 4 and the No. 1 Mark III and other variants would continue to be used by the British military and Commonwealth nations throughout the 1950s and beyond. Though popular worldwide, many of the nations that still use it are former British colonies or Commonwealth nations such as Canada, South Africa, Australia, and Bangladesh, though these are mostly used by reservists, ceremonial units, or as a training weapon. In India and Pakistan, SMLEs are still used by local militia in rural areas to protect against cross-border terrorism. In Afghanistan, many fighters there prefer the SMLE to the ubiquitous AK-47 due to its greater range and accuracy. And if acquiring an actual Lee Enfield is too difficult, gunsmiths in the Khyber Pass between Afghanistan and Pakistan have made countless copies of this venerable piece of military hardware. The MG42. Perhaps the most feared small arms weapon used by the Germans in World War II was the MG42. Designed as a cheaper and easier to manufacture replacement for the MG34 machine gun, it was introduced into the German military in 1942 and gained popularity by its users as a devastating piece of hardware. The most distinguishing feature of the MG42 was its rate of fire, capable of unleashing between 1,200 and 1,500 rounds per minute. The firing was so rapid that it was very difficult to distinguish individual rounds being fired, giving a sustained burst the sound of a zipper opening. As a result, allies who found themselves on the wrong side of one of these weapons dubbed it Hitler's zipper or Hitler's buzzsaw. Though this was intimidating, it was as much a liability as a benefit. Because of the extreme rate of fire, the barrel would quickly overheat, forcing crews to change out the barrels frequently, sometimes after only firing between 200 to 250 rounds. Of the 6 men assigned to an MG42 crew, the spotter was given the responsibility for carrying extra barrels, which could be swapped out quickly from a latch on the right side of the gun. The MG42 saw service in every theater the German military fought in and became a hallmark of the Wehrmacht, being used by mobile troops in the field or in fixed emplacements, such as along the Atlantic Wall. In addition to the Germans, the MG42 saw service in the militaries of many nations, including Italy, Romania, Zaire, Portugal, Spain, Norway, and many others. The unique design features inspired many more modern machine guns, including the Austrian MG74, the Swiss MG710-3, and the American M60. While not directly in service any longer, its successor, the German MG3, is still being used by many nations around the world, and is, for all practical purposes, an MG42 that's chambered in NATO standard 7.62 by 51mm, instead of 7.92 by 57mm Mauser, and a few other deviations. The Madson light machine gun. Patented all the way back in 1901, the Madson LMG made its combat debut in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War. During World War I, 1,250 units were purchased by the Russian Crown for use in the nascent Imperial Russian Air Service. The German Army experimented on 500 of them, chambered in a 7.92mm configuration, until they were replaced with Maxim 08 15s. Adopted more widely in the Second World War, the Madson was the standard light machine gun of the Danish and Norwegian armies. They were later utilized by the Germans after their conquest of Denmark and Norway. One of the Madson's biggest customers was Brazil, Brazil, who bought batches in 1932, 1935, and 1949. In the 1950s, they were all upgraded to the 7.62 by 51mm NATO configuration, which had been released in 1950. This final evolution of the Madson LMG had a better range of 1,200 yards, or about 1,097 meters, but still had the same cyclical rate of 400 to 500 rounds per minute as the foundational M101-04 model. In 1996, the Brazilian Armed Forces transferred their Madsons to the underfunded Brazilian military police, whose pre-existing CAR-15s, M16s, and FNFALs were falling apart, usually operated by a 2 to 3 man crew with a bipod. They were instead supported by a sling across one shoulder by one person. A favorite of the Rio de Janeiro police force even today, these weapons are so powerful that even a sustained burst of them is said to have a morale-sapping effect on the drug gangs of the favela shanty towns. The M1911. At the turn of the 20th century, after experiences in the Philippines, the American military was in need of a firearm to replace the .38 caliber revolvers it issued to its troops, recommending that the new pistol be chambered in .45 at the very least, and preferably semi-automatic. In 1907, firearm designer John Browning went to work, and what came off the drawing board is perhaps the most legendary pistol to enter service in the American military. The Colt M1911, chambered in .45 ACP, became the standard issue pistol when the U.S. entered World War I, and soon became popular as a powerful and effective handgun that was an asset in the trenches. After the war, the 1911 was redesigned with an updated trigger and a few other slight modifications. The new version was designated the M1911A1, the A1 standing for Alteration 1, and was officially adopted in 1924, and remained the standard issue sidearm for the U.S. military during World War II. The 1911 has seen service with all branches of the U.S. military, as well as dozens of nations around the world. It was used in both world wars, the Korean War, Vietnam, where it was popular among tunnel rats, and virtually every other conflict that saw American troops deployed in the latter half of the 20th century. Even after it was officially replaced in the 1980s by the M9 Beretta, many troops still carried a 1911. And the weapon has seen service during the Persian Gulf War, as well as Operation Iraqi Freedom and the conflict in Afghanistan. Even today, many nations still use the 1911, some using updated versions such as the Type 86 pistol, which is an M1911A1 made in Thailand under license, and some just using vintage 1911s such as the Philippines, Bangladesh, Greece, and many others. The US military also still uses 1911s in a limited capacity with some special operations groups, and is a popular choice among many civilian law enforcement agencies. The design of the 1911 is also a popular choice among civilians, and there are a plethora of companies that produce their own version of this venerable pistol for civilian firearm enthusiasts, many of whom are veterans who have fond memories of John Browning's creation, the M3 Grease Gun. In 1940, officials at the United States Army Ordnance Department oversaw one of the greatest military modernization drives of the 20th century. Earmarked for replacement was the legendary Thompson submachine gun, which at an eye-watering $45 per unit, around $660 in today's money, was considered far too expensive. Substituting it would be a weapon that, although more basic-looking, was equally as deadly and much cheaper to manufacture. In January 1943, a manufacturing contract for 300,000 M3 grease guns was approved. In comparison to the Thompson, the grease gun cost just $20.94 per unit. To keep costs down, the gun could only fire fully automatic. It earned its grease gun nickname due to its resemblance to a mechanic's lubricant insertion tool, but it was also known as the plumber's nightmare or the cake decorator. A submachine gun with a blistering rate of fire of 450 rounds per minute, using the .45 ACP rounds, the same as the Thompson, the M3 was comprised of only 73 parts, only the bolt and barrel requiring costly machining, while all other components came from pressed or stamped sheet metal. Out in the field, the grease gun received a mixed response from the soldiers. Some praised it for its reliability, but others despised it for its flimsy cocking lever and error-prone 30-round box magazine. This This would frequently jam if there was a minuscule amount of dirt inside, a problem solved by the inclusion of a special loading tool and plastic protective covers. Dropping or knocking the gun could shear off the firearm's retracting wire stock and render it virtually useless. After the war, the grease gun saw service in the Korean and Vietnam Wars, as well as multiple Cold War flare-ups in Latin America and Southeast Asia. It was last used by the U.S. Army in the 1991 Gulf War, after which it was discontinued. Nowadays, this World War II relic continues to be a good option for those with budget constraints. The Filipino Navy and Marine Corps currently use M3 grease guns upgraded with suppressors and red dot sights because they couldn't afford pricier submachine guns like the Uzi or the Fluoro 9mm SMG. The M101 Howitzer. The M101 Howitzer. It took its inspiration from German howitzers captured during World War I and was issued to American troops in 1940, over 20 years after the drawing up of the first blueprints in 1919. Its long developmental cycle meant that before its manufacture in 1939, the carriage it was mounted on had to be redesigned to fit modern standards, as the original had only been designed to be pulled by horses rather than vehicles. A common sight in the European and Pacific theaters of war, the hefty M101, weighing 2,258 kilograms, was towed by a separate motorized M2 carriage. It launched 105mm high-explosive semi-fixed ammunition at a maximum range of 11,270 meters, quickly garnering a reputation as a punchy and accurate infantry support weapon. By the end of the conflict, a total of 8,536 units had been assembled, with post-war production continuing until 1953. Fitted with a long-lasting barrel and carriage, the M101's service life extended well into the post-war decades, during which it was deployed in the Korean and Vietnam Wars, as well as a number of regional conflicts. The M101 was eventually phased out by other militaries, largely remaining in storage until the Russia-Ukraine war. In September 2022, it was reported that Lithuania had donated an undisclosed amount of the guns to Ukrainian forces in their struggle against Russia. Despite being designed over 100 years ago, the M101 is still useful because it uses the same 105mm ammunition that most modern light artillery systems utilize. It's also being operated in combination with real-time updates provided by drones to improve its precision. And its range has been increased by 40% because it's able to fire M927 rocket-assisted projectiles. The D44 gun. Introduced to the Soviet Red Army just after the end of World War II, the D44 Divisional Anti-Tank Field Gun was intended to replace the older ZIS-3 field gun that had been in service since 1941. Based on the main armament of the T-34-85 tank, it had an 85mm barrel and entered full-scale production in 1946. Most effectively operated by 8 men, the D44 was a dangerous adversary that could fire off 20 rounds per minute. It had a maximum range of between 15.6 kilometers or 9.7 miles and could fire a variety of high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds. At an effective range of 1 kilometer, the HVAP round was capable of penetrating between 100 and 180 millimeters of armor. Among other types of ammunition available, the D44 can also fire the BK2M Heat FS round, which can penetrate up to 300 millimeters of armor. Between 1945 to 1954, the Soviet Union manufactured 10,800 D44s. It's been in many conflicts, including the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Arab War against Israel, and it's been exported to countries such as Egypt, Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Poland, Romania, and Syria. In May of 2022, a video emerged showing ex-Soviet D44s in operation on the front lines of the Russia-Ukraine war. While some are being used as standalone artillery pieces, others have been mounted on the top of old 1970s MTLB armored tractors as makeshift turrets by innovative Ukrainian engineers to produce basic mobile tank destroyers. History's oversized guns. Ever since their initial conception, weapons that use gunpowder have come in a variety of shapes and sizes. One of the main aims of firearm design over the years has been to make the weapons smaller and easier to handle. There are some cases, however, when this is put aside and the weapons are made with anything but subtlety in mind. Here are a few examples of oversized guns used throughout history. Punt guns. One of the most extreme examples of an oversized firearm comes not from the battlefield, but from civilian hunters. Shotguns are specially designed to shoot a spread of pellets, which is ideal for hunting birds in flight. A punt gun takes this simple idea to a new level. Utilized in the 19th century, the punt gun is a gargantuan shotgun that resembled an artillery piece rather than a hunting weapon. It would be mounted onto the bow of a punt or small boat. These weapons varied in size, but could weigh upwards of 200 pounds, could well be over 10 feet in length, had a barrel diameter of 2 inches, and could fire over a pound of shot in a single blast, which was so powerful that the recoil could propel its boat back several feet. For comparison, a 12-gauge shotgun, already a large and powerful firearm, has a bore of less than 3/4 of an inch and contains about an ounce of shot per shell. For the most part, these punt guns were single-shot, muzzle-loaded pieces. The hunter would either use small poles or oars to quietly position his boat in an area where waterfowl, such as ducks and geese, were likely to congregate in large numbers on the water. Once enough birds had gathered, the hunter would fire the gun, hitting up to 100 targets at once. Sometimes entire flocks would be wiped out in seconds, especially if there was more than one punt on the hunt. Generally, the hunter would sell his quarry, as the demand for wild game made large-scale hunting like this a very lucrative business. Because of these and other unrestricted hunting methods, the numbers of migratory birds began to drop in the late 19th century, causing concern among the growing conservation movement. State and federal regulations were put in place, including making this commercial style of hunting illegal, setting limits on the number of waterfowl permitted to be shot, and restrictions on the type of weapons that can be used. As a result, the use of the punt gun and boat became banned for hunting, and bird populations were able to recover. These guns may be illegal for hunting, but they are still legal to own in the United States. They're seen as a novelty and far too large for anything other than making a loud bang and hitting anything other than a stationary target. GI's Oversized Training Guns. During the Second World War, massive numbers of men joined the armed forces, many of whom were unfamiliar with handling firearms. The U.S. military needed a way to familiarize its new recruits with the weapons that they were going to be using in the field. A number of methods were used, including posters and training films showing the proper use of firearms. One training method was much more hands-on. The training aids were replicas of real firearms, but scaled up to twice the size. These would be made out of aluminum and would be hollow, making them easy to handle. These firearms were non-functional, but would still contain the inner workings of the weapon they represented, giving soldiers an easy way to identify the parts of the real weapon they would be issued later on. A number of training aids were created to help familiarize troops, including the first type, designated the device 3F3, which was an enlarged M1918A2 Browning automatic rifle. It was soon joined by the M21, a double-sized M1 carbine, the M22, a scaled-up M1919 Browning machine gun, and the M24, which was an oversized M1 Garand, which also came with plastic rounds and a double-sized clip, which could be loaded to demonstrate proper technique. These training aids were used well into the 1950s until they were phased out by newer firearms such as the M14 and M16 assault rifles and the M60 machine gun. These newer firearms did have double-sized mock-ups made for training purposes, but these were to a much lesser extent than their Second World War counterparts, and the concept eventually faded from training protocols. The oversized training aids would eventually be retired from service, being either given to museums or making their way into military surplus shops, and eventually ending up in the collections of military enthusiasts as a fascinating part of firearms history. Anti-tank rifles. During the First World War, tanks were introduced to the battlefield, forever changing the art of warfare. The original tanks were all but impervious to small arms fire, and were able to roll over infantry-filled trenches with impunity. As a response, the race was on to create infantry weapons that could take out these new armored behemoths, leading to the creation of a new type of firearm, the anti-tank rifle. Many nations created some version of the anti-tank rifle, including the British Boys 55 caliber, the Japanese Type 97 Kyunanashiki Judoho, the German Panzerbuchse 39, and the Soviet Union's single-round PTR-D41 and 5-round PTR-S41 anti-tank rifles, both of which fired the same 14.5 by 114mm cartridge. There were similarities shared by all the types. These were large weapons, weighing between a manageable 35 pounds to the truly gargantuan 500-pound Mauser 2.8cm Schwere Panzerbuchse 41. They're also long, with barrel lengths alone often in excess of 4 feet, longer than many standard rifles. The ammunition fired by these weapons were also large, with 50 caliber being the starting point for bore dimensions, and only increasing from there. As can be imagined, the recoil would be horrendous, as many infantrymen's shoulders can attest. Generally, these weapons were not mounted on a vehicle since they were designed for use by infantry. They would be carried on foot, meaning that the weapons would be crew-served, usually with a gunner and an assistant, who carried extra ammunition and equipment. In combat, anti-tank weapons had a mixed performance. They were no doubt powerful, accurate, and had a long range, and some, such as the Soviet PTR-S41 and PTR-D41, caused havoc among German vehicles. As the Second World War progressed, however, more heavily armored tanks entered service, which were too strong for even the most powerful anti-tank rifle, rendering them obsolete for their original purpose. Instead of falling by the wayside, however, the anti-tank rifle spawned a successful spin-off, the anti-material rifle, or AM. While heavy tanks were for the most part impervious to a high-caliber rifle round, trucks, half-trucks, and other lightly armored vehicles were not. Anti-material rifles such as the American Barrett M82 are still in use today and are utilized to target lighter vehicles, as well as buildings, radar stations, parked aircraft, and any number of other targets. The Jile musket. Oversized firearms are not always the product of recent times, but can be traced back to much earlier eras of firearm technology. In large portions of Central Asia, the Jile became a fixture of the warriors of the region. Jiles are muskets, either matchlock or flintlock, their most distinctive feature being the highly curved stock, which gives it its distinctive shape. Unlike standard muskets used during the era by European powers, Jiles were handmade according to the personal style of the gunsmith. They can also be highly decorated with metal inlays, gemstones, and any number of other adornments. Though they can come in all manner of shapes and sizes, generally Jiles are long, with a much longer barrel length than a typical musket. This gave the weapon a much greater range and accuracy compared to its counterparts, such as the British Brown Bess. There are some accounts that place the range of the Jile at 500 meters, though this may be an exaggeration, with a 250-meter range more typical. This still outranges a European musket by about 100 meters. The long barrel meant that it was often employed with a barrel rest to maintain accuracy. In the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan, tribal warriors would fire from elevated positions, resting the barrel on rocks. Jiles were military weapons and fired military-sized musket balls, roughly equivalent to 50 or 75 caliber, much larger rounds than were found in the other long-barreled hunting firearms. This meant that not only was the Jile capable of long-range shooting, but also packed a devastating punch. They also weighed between 12 and 14 pounds, much heavier than European muskets, which are usually between 8 to 10 pounds. This would make them more unwieldy, but the increased size reduces the recoil, which helps improve accuracy. In 1842, during the First Anglo-Afghan War, warriors wielding Jiles obliterated a British column as it withdrew from Kabul. Firing from an elevated position, the Afghans were able to pick off the British, who were powerless to fight back. Of the 16,500 soldiers, camp followers, and their family members who set out, only a single British soldier and a handful of sepoys escaped, a testament to the tenacity of Afghan warriors and the power of the Jile. When the survivor, an assistant surgeon named William Bryden, reached the safety of Jalalabad, some 90 miles from the scene of the massacre, he was asked where the army was, to which he replied, "I am the army." Throughout the long history of firearms, some weapons have gained renown for their reliability, accuracy, or overall utility. Some have become well known for their participation in landmark historical events. These are just a few of the firearms, however, that have left a mark, not necessarily because of their function, but for their ridiculous proportions and scale. We upload all the videos that we have to censor from YouTube to our Patreon. Right now, you can watch uncensored videos on the Battle of Can Tien, medieval warfare, and the Sherman tank, all on Patreon.
History is epic. Watch it uncensored.